there, space explorers! Enjoy the video and don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the description for more cosmic fun.
Imagine hearing this deep, guttural howl, a sound that hasn't echoed for what, over 10,000 years?
Yeah, the sound of the dire wolf.
Yeah.
Extinct. Gone.
Until maybe now. Not from digging up bones, but from a lab. That's the story we're diving into today.
It really is something else.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're unpacking a story that, well, it made waves everywhere in early 2025. Colossal Biosciences and their dire wolf de-extinction project.
Big headlines.
Huge. And you've sent over a ton of material, scientific reports, big media pieces, expert opinions. We're going to sift through all of it.
Yep.
The goal, to understand not just what happened, but how and what everyone thinks it means, the different angles, and, what comes next.
Basically, get you fully up to speed.
Exactly. Your shortcut to really getting this topic, it sits right at this wild intersection of biology, ethics, even pop culture.
It definitely forces you to think about what's possible. Science fiction turning into, well, science fact right before our eyes.
Yeah, this project really pushes things. So, okay, let's unpack this. The big question, how on earth did they actually do it? How did Colossal manage this?
Well, first you got to understand the starting point. Before this, getting a dire wolf genome was, well, it was tough. Really tough.
Almost nothing, right? I saw a figure. 0.1%.
Exactly. Barely anything to work with. The big breakthrough for Colossal came from Beth Shapiro's team. She's a paleogeneticist.
Right.
They got their hands on some incredibly well-preserved fossils, a tooth about 13,000 years old, and an inner ear bone, much older, like 72,000 years old.
Wow. And that made the difference.
Huge difference. From those, they sequenced a much more complete genome. We're talking 500 times more data than anyone had before. That was step one, the foundation.
Okay, 500 times more data. That's colossal, pardon the pun. What did all that new data actually tell them about the dire wolf itself?
Well, it showed, maybe surprisingly, about 99.5% DNA similarity with modern gray wolves.
Oh, so pretty close then.
Genetically similar, yes. But, and this is key, the evolutionary analysis, it showed dire wolves, Anaceon dirus, are a totally distinct genus. They split off from gray wolves like 5 or 6 million years ago.
Whoa, okay, so not just a big gray wolf, a whole different branch.
A very different branch. And here's something really interesting, a new twist. The latest analysis hints they might have been hybrids. Hybrids of two ancient dog lineages.
It's complicated.
Huh. Okay, so they get this vastly improved genetic blueprint, but then comes the editing, the CRISPR part. You mentioned they didn't actually put old dire wolf DNA in anything.
No, exactly. That's crucial. No ancient DNA was inserted. What they did was edit modern gray wolf DNA.
How? Like, what were they changing?
They targeted specific spots. About 20 edits across 14 different genes. These were the genes known to influence traits where dire wolves differed from gray wolves.
Like a size. They were bigger, right?
Yep. Bigger body size, broader skull, stronger jaw. And also, interestingly, that white, shaggy fur coat.
They engineered the fur color. They did, based on an ancient genetic variant they found. So it's more like rewriting the existing code than inserting old code.
And how did they technically do the editing? Was there anything new there?
They used multiplex CRISPR-Cas9. That lets you make several changes at once. But the really novel part was what they edited. They used these endothelial progenitor cells.
Which come from?
From gray wolf blood, which is way less invasive than, say, taking skin biopsies.
Ah, okay. So easier to get, less stress on the animal. Sounds useful for, well, other things too.
Potentially, yes. A big step forward for getting cloning material, especially for sensitive species.
Okay, so they've got these edited gray wolf cells. The next massive hurdle is turning those cells into, well, a living creature. How did the cloning part work?
They used SCNT. Somatic cell nuclear transfer. It's the technique used for Dolly the sheep,
Right, the standard cloning method.
Pretty much. Take the nucleus from an edited gray wolf cell, put it into a dog egg cell that's had its own nucleus removed, then you stimulate that egg to divide like an embryo.
And implant that into a surrogate mother.
Exactly. And because they expected big pups, they chose large domestic dogs as surrogates. Mixed breed hounds specifically.
Makes sense. So when did the world get its first glimpse of these pups?
The first ones, Romulus and Remus, were born via C-section on October 1st, 2024. Gestation was about 65 days, pretty normal for dogs.
Romulus and Remus, okay.
2 males, genetically identical clones but carried by different surrogates. Then a third pup, a female named Colossal, arrived in January 2025.
Colossal, right. I think I heard about a fourth one.
Sadly, yes. A fourth pup from Khaleesi's litter died at just 10 days old. An unrelated intestinal infection, apparently. Not directly due to the cloning, but still tragic.
Definitely. And getting those 3 live births, what did that take? How many attempts?
The numbers are pretty stark. They used 8 surrogate dogs and implanted roughly 45 embryos into each surrogate.
Wow, 8 dogs, maybe 360 embryos for 3 live pups.
Yeah. It really highlights that cloning is still, it's incredibly inefficient and difficult.
No kidding. Despite those challenges, Colossal obviously announced this as a huge success. The world's first successfully de-extincted animal. George Church calling it transformative. Why were they so bullish, given the low success rate?
Well, for them is proof of concept. It showed their whole de-extinction toolkit could work, even on a really hard target.
It's harder than a mammoth, they said.
Much harder, they argued, because dire wolves don't have any super close living relatives like mammoths have elephants. They had to build new ways to piece together the genome, figure out the key differences. So, successfully creating these pups, even just a few, validated their whole approach, their pipeline.
Okay, proof of concept. But that claim, successfully de-extincted, that didn't exactly land smoothly with everyone, did it?
Oh, not at all. The scientific community almost immediately pushed back hard.
The core issue being, are they really dire wolves?
Exactly. That became the immediate debate. Publications like Scientific American straight up called them genetically modified gray wolves with dire-like traits.
Not de-extincted dire wolves.
No. And you had paleoecologist Jacqueline Gill with that really cutting quote.
The Neanderthal one.
Yeah, I have more than 14 Neanderthal genes in me, and we wouldn't call me a Neanderthal. She basically called them designer dogs.
Ouch. So the argument from Gill and others was what? That 20 edits isn't enough.
Pretty much. Paleontologist Julie Meechan made a similar point. She said, look, even if it's only 0.5% different DNA overall, that's still millions of individual genetic differences.
Millions.
Millions of base pairs. She said, I don't think they're actually dire wolves because you haven't accounted for all those other differences. And the traditional definition of a species requires it to be genomically distinct, self-sustaining in the wild. These pups don't meet that.
So critics are saying these engineered traits don't really tell us much new about actual dire wolf biology or ecology.
Would they look like dire wolves, perhaps, but are they functionally the same? Probably not, is the argument.
So how did Colossal respond? How did Beth Shapiro defend the de-extinction claim?
Shapiro talked about a different way of thinking about it. She invoked the morphological species concept.
Meaning, if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck.
Sort of.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is they were aiming for a functional proxy, something that looks and ideally maybe even acts like a dire wolf, even if it's not a perfect 100% genetic match.
Which she admitted wasn't possible anyway.
Right. She said 100% identity is not really possible. So she framed it as functional de-extinction. Enough traits are restored that you can, in a practical sense, consider the species revived.
Functional de-extinction. That's an interesting term. It feels like we're bumping up against the limits of our definitions.
We really are. And Wired magazine kind of leaned into that ambiguity.
What did they say?
They suggested maybe the whole semantic debate is beside the point. They call them wolves, altered at the genetic level by man for his own purposes, something new and very, very old.
Something new and very, very old. That captures it well. It feels less like just arguing over a word and more about acknowledging we're in new territory. Our old boxes for species might not fit anymore.
Exactly. It exposes how traditional biology struggles when humans can directly intervene and reshape the evolutionary path like this. This whole debate is really a sign of a much bigger shift in how we think about nature itself.
Okay, so we've got the science, the semantics, but what about the actual lives of these animals? And the bigger picture? Once you make them, what happens next? What's life like for Romulus and Remus? Time had that great line about the Ritz-Carlton lifestyle of a wolf.
Yeah, it paints a picture, doesn't it? Apparently, even at 6 months, they were big, 4 feet long, 80 pounds, and despite being hand-reared, they were acting pretty wild, wary of people.
Where are they living?
They're at a secret wildlife preserve. Supposedly 2,000 acres, somewhere in the northern U.S. Khaleesi isn't on display yet, still too young.
But even 2,000 acres, is that enough? And what about the wolf part? Are they learning to be wolves?
That's a huge question. Adam Boyko, a geneticist at Cornell, pointed this out. Pups raised by humans, without a pack, without the food they would have eaten, they won't behave like wild wolves. They don't even have the right gut bacteria, the microbiome, that their ancestors had.
So no plans to release them into the wild?
No. Shapiro confirmed they'll stay in captivity for study. That Ritz-Carlton life, as Time put it, highlights that genetics is only part of the story, the environment, the social learning. That's maybe just as important for being a real wolf or dire wolf.
And even if they were genetically perfect and raised by wolves, where would they even go? Their whole world is gone.
That's probably the biggest ecological hurdle. Rick McIntyre, who spent decades studying wolves in Yellowstone, made this point very clearly. Dire wolves were specialized hunters.
They ate mammoths and stuff.
Exactly. Pleistocene megafauna. Giant bison, mammoths, ancient horses. That whole ecosystem, that specific niche they occupied, it just doesn't exist anymore.
So what would they even do?
It's hard to say. Christopher Preston, an environmental philosopher, questioned their ecological role too. He pointed out that even modern gray wolves face huge challenges finding space and avoiding conflict with us. So, dropping in a resurrected megafauna predator, it's ecologically problematic, to say the least.
Which brings us squarely to the ethics. It seems like there are strong arguments on both sides here. What's the case for doing this, ethically speaking?
Colossal really pushes the conservation angle. They see this technology as a potential tool to prevent future extinctions, or maybe even add genetic diversity back into endangered populations.
Like the red wolves, I read they cloned some of those too.
Yes, using the same blood cell SCNT method, they cloned 4 endangered red wolf pups. Wired called that a less flashy but more significant conservation win. It could genuinely help that species.
Okay, so potential conservation spin-offs.
Right. And people like Alta Charo, one of Colossal's advisors, argue the dire wolf project itself is a symbol of hope. It generates excitement, investment, and maybe develops tech that helps living species.
But the flip side, the animal welfare concerns seem pretty serious, especially with the cloning process.
Absolutely. Robert Klitzman, a bioethicist at Columbia, didn't mince words. He warned about a lot of suffering.
For the surrogates.
Primarily, yes. Remember those numbers. 8 surrogates, potentially hundreds of embryos transferred, high rates of miscarriage, procedural risks. It's tough on the animals involved.
And what about the pups themselves? Is a 2,000-acre preserve really a good life for something descended from Ice Age predators?
That's the other welfare concern. Wild wolves can roam hundreds of square miles. Even a large enclosure could be, as Klitzman put it, awfully lonely and claustrophobic for an animal with those instincts.
Then there's the whole playing God argument and the resources. Is this the best use of conservation money and effort?
That's a major criticism. Jennifer Doudna, who co-invented CRISPR, expressed her own unease. She basically asked, shouldn't we try not to alter nature more than we already have?
Right. Does focusing on bringing back the extinct distract from saving what's still here?
That's the worry. Critics argue these high-profile, expensive de-extinction projects divert attention and funding from crucial on-the-ground conservation for species teetering on the brink right now. And it might create this false sense of security, like, oh, it's okay if they go extinct, we can just bring them back later.
Which we probably can't for most species.
Exactly. Now, Colossal's counter-argument is interesting. Ben Lamb, the CEO, was pretty open about it. He said the dire wolf is glitzy, sexy, and fun.
Sexy and fun.
His point was, using such a charismatic, almost mythical creature helps drive awareness for wolf conservation more broadly. It attracts attention, maybe investment that traditional conservation struggles to get.
So using spectacle to fund the science and maybe conservation.
That seems to be part of the strategy, which leads us right into how this whole thing played out in public.
Yeah, the lines felt really blurred here. Science, sure, but also spectacle, pop culture. Colossal's media strategy was intense, right? Announcing it everywhere before the science was peer-reviewed.
That definitely raised eyebrows in the scientific community. Jessica McKenzie, writing for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, was quite critical.
What was her take?
She said essentially, we don't do science by press release, by New Yorker and Time magazine announcements. She questioned if it was hyped primarily for publicity, maybe to attract investors, before the data had really been scrutinized by other scientists.
Has the data come out now?
A preprint paper is circulating, yes. But the initial rollout was pure high-impact media. It sparked this whole debate. Does this kind of splashy announcement inspire public interest in science, or does it risk misleading people and oversimplifying complex issues?
And they leaned hard into the pop culture stuff, didn't they? The Game of Thrones connection was everywhere.
Oh, completely. That show made dire wolves famous to a whole new generation. Colossal knew that.
Naming the pup Khaleesi.
Yep. And Romulus and Remus, connecting to ancient myth. But the most striking thing was probably that promotional image the New Yorker described.
The one with the pups on the throne.
The fluffy white pups sitting on a literal iron throne made of swords. You can't get a more direct merger of science and pop culture fantasy than that. It went viral, obviously.
And the howl video.
Right. Colossal posted a video, supposedly the first howl of a dire wolf in 10,000 years. Huge engagement online. They were masters at playing the media and pop culture game.
But that kind of hype also brings out the skeptics and the jokes. The Jurassic Park references must have been flying.
Non-stop. Everywhere you looked online, someone was quoting Jeff Goldblum. Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Classic.
Totally. Lots of jokes about diet wolves or colossally exaggerating. Reddit threads debating it, memes comparing Ben Lamb to John Hammond from the movie.
So a mix of fascination and deep skepticism.
Absolutely. It shows how these big scientific claims get processed through our cultural filters, through movies and memes.
But beneath the snark, there is a genuine sense of wonder too, right? I mean, extinct for 10,000 years, now alive again. That's a powerful hook. What's the lasting impact of that beyond the jokes?
I think that's true. There's real awe there. It does make people think about what's possible, even if they're skeptical of the dire wolf label. It definitely fueled speculation. You know, is this the start of a real Jurassic Park scenario? Even though scientists say dinosaurs are pretty much impossible.
And it put a spotlight on other projects.
For sure. People started talking more about Colossal's woolly mammoth project, or that woolly mouse they made earlier with mammoth genes. It also sparked genuine ethical discussions in the mainstream, and interest from unexpected places, like those indigenous groups wondering about hosting dire wolves.
So it forces a conversation.
Definitely. It serves as this really vivid example of how fast CRISPR and synthetic biology are moving, how blurry the lines between sci-fi and reality are getting. And it highlights the role of private money pouring into biotech. It makes people confront these huge ideas in a way a standard research paper just doesn't.
So wrapping this up, this deep dive has definitely shown us a project that's, well, it's a technological marvel on one level. Bringing ancient genetics back to life is incredible stuff.
No doubt about the technical achievement. It's stunning.
But it's also sitting right at this complicated intersection. Amazing science, yes, but also really thorny ethical questions and some very slick PR.
It really forces us to grapple with big questions. What does de-extinction even mean now? What are the real-world consequences of bringing animals back into ecosystems that have completely changed? It's a case study in the power and the potential pitfalls of humanity reshaping life itself.
Which brings us to our final thought, something for you, the listener, to chew on. As we gain this almost godlike power to rewrite the story of life, how do you define de-extinction? What responsibilities come with that power? Not just to the animals we might create, but to the whole web of life, the future of the planet. What does this dire wolf story mean for your understanding of our relationship with nature now that the boundaries seem so flexible?